Let's talk about using icons inside of our interfaces. So the first thing is functionality. Are the icons making a difference? Does the icon represent something well enough to where with or without a label, and those are two different scenarios, but is the icon actually enhancing the functionality? In the example of social media links, you can put a link for Twitter, a link for Instagram, a link for Facebook. Pretty much everyone knows what those are going to do if you click on them. So you don't actually need to say Facebook, Twitter, Instagram in addition to those icons. It's more of a ubiquitous representation. So in that case, they are very functional and they are definitely usable. But when you're designing custom interfaces for custom projects and apps, there's a little bit more of a gray area. Like, does everybody know that filter is going to be like, should you use a funnel for filter or should you use something else? There are some gray areas. So you need to make sure that the functionality is first and foremost enhanced by using an icon. And it's not just all about aesthetics. To make really good icons, you do need to focus on aesthetics, but you just need to make sure that you're enhancing the functionality. So if you have 10 icons in a row with no label, that's not going to be very functional because not everyone is going to be able to guess which icon does what. I made this mistake early on in my career, and sometimes you just have to go through those types of lessons. Okay, so second thing I think about when I'm designing icons is the commonality of the icons. Are they similar? I don't want to use a 1 pixel stroke icon with a 2 pixel stroke icon. So if you are to go and find a professionally designed icon set, it's going to be very common. All of the negative space is going to be really similar. All of the stroke sizes are going to be similar. Even if you're using a solid icon set, the solid fills and the negative space around the solid shapes are going to be very, very common. There's going to be a nice cohesive language associated with those icon sets. Okay, and the third thing that you want to think about when you're using icons is the personality. How much personality do these icons add to this particular project? Is it kind of more of a standard, reserved, just kind of label only? Or is it more fun and engaging? Or is it something else? And this kind of applies to the style. And so those are the three things that I really look at when I'm using icons. So enough about all of the theory. So let's just dive into some actual examples, both on some mainstream apps and projects that I've personally worked on. First of all, we're going to look at iOS, looking at the settings screen on iOS. So we've got a bunch of icons here. And not only do we have icons, we also have like a color-coded background. You can kind of infer what's happening here with the icons. Like, they're pretty standard, but they have a little bit of personality. But one of the biggest things I want to point out here is everything is extremely consistent. There is a box around each one of these icons, a very literal box with rounded rectangles, and it's exactly the same on exactly the same spacing. Even, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. A lot of the negative space around these icons, none of them are touching. None of them are touching the edge. The white piece doesn't go all the way to the edge. And you're gonna have a bit of a kind of a consistent negative space. And we're not too worried that this circle comes up a little bit closer because it's kind of balanced with the shape down below, but there's just a nice negative space inside of the container, and it's not all crammed into one little tiny space. There's breathing room, the same way that we add breathing room to the margins and the paddings of our typography, of our buttons. It's kind of the same thing on a little bit smaller of a scale. So we want breathing room on the outside of the icons. And if we use a container, not all the time are we gonna have containers, but if we do, we wanna make sure there's nice breathing room all the way around. And in this example, these are very, very functional. Airplane mode, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, personal hotspot. I think all of these are very, very common icons, maybe except for personal hotspot. This is maybe a new introduction, but because they are kind of linking it with cellular, with the color, it makes a little bit more sense. They would probably not be able to get away with using this icon without the label. but because it's very conventional with the color, the stroke size of this stroke right here is the exact same size as this on the cellular. It's really similar to the one on the Bluetooth. So if any of these are using a similar stroke size, it's going to feel pretty common. The one thing I would kind of critique here, this notifications icon, it's a really, really thin stroke. And I wonder, this one feels almost out of place compared to the strokes on the volume for sounds and the strokes here, the stroke here. If they would make this stroke size larger, I think it would fit in with this family a little bit more. So that's just a tiny little critique. But you can also see like there is an additional stroke, even though this is considered a solid icon, there's a stroke inside of here that this little detail here is similar to the detail on this. But there you can tell there's a slightly larger size on these versus those. So I honestly think that you could spend a small amount of time and get the notifications and the screen time icons maybe a little bit closer in line with these stroked versions. So there's some very, very small little details and just in terms of how the icon is designed. But overall, I just really want to point out that there is a container and it's treated like an object with breathing space on the inside and then breathing room on the outside. And it's treated kind of as a block. Looking over here at the Facebook example, there's a lot more of kind of an organic feel. They're not all inside of a container like that. I believe that Facebook wants to feel more friendly and more personal. They don't want to feel like corporate overlords. They want to feel friendly. They want to feel personal. So they're using very organic shapes with little gradients, multicolor with gradients, with drop shadows. They're trying to give this almost environment, and they're very strategically using blue and green, blue across here. They're fading these linear gradients across. So simple shapes, but just adding a touch of personality with these gradients and drop shadows, and just a lot more of an organic when you compare it to the Facebook icons. But if you look at the containers, I've got containers drawn here, you can see that each one of these is definitely very much inside of a container. And this one, the Facebook is using slightly larger icons at a 32 pixel container. Most of your icons inside of your interfaces, especially ones that have to do with functionality, the kind of gold standard is going to be 24 by 24 pixels icons. That's what you're going to have down here in the tab bar for your navigation. Sometimes you might find 25 by 25, kind of a different can of worms based on like the odd 375 pixels that go all the way across. But 1 pixel difference, it's not really going to make that big of a difference. So as a general rule of thumb, 24 by 24 is kind of the gold standard. Even if you look back over here at these icons, this is a 24 by 24 bounding box. And you can tell that each one of these icons is pretty much going to fit inside of that 24 by 24 bounding box. However, they do have the container behind them. These containers are actually at a 29 by 29 inside of each one of these little line items here. So each one of these line items has its very own specific container, but it's consistent. And I just want to point that out because it doesn't matter if it's 28 by 28 or 29 by 29. It might create some odd internal friction that it's like, it bothers me that it's 29 by 29. I don't really know why it's that size. Why not just go 28? But that's a whole different story. But most importantly, there's a very consistent usage of the icons, and you can see that the spacing looks really nice. The line weights are very consistent. There's almost a boring quality to it. It's just very systematic. And I don't mean boring in the sense that these don't look good, but just it's very, very calculated, very systematic. And you have to be systematic with your icons. Thinking of them as a block inside of your interface is a great start. And so same thing with here, there's a very systematic usage of size. So even the ones that are smaller, they can occupy kind of a smaller area, but ones that are a little bit larger, like the friends here, like it can expand out into the negative space a little bit more because it's smaller at the top. So we're kind of looking at overall weight inside of that container. And this is more for kind of designing icons. If you're just using an icon set, you're typically going to have a very standard and consistent feel. But it's also interesting to see on Facebook that for all of these main sections like friends, groups, marketplace, all of these are very colorful and they have a lot of personality. But then on help and support and things that are maybe a little bit more technical, they've used full grayscale. And I think this is a really smart usage of color when it comes to friends and personal and pages and dating, gaming. All of this is kind of like more personal and friendly and has to do more with the social network versus the help center, support, report a problem, settings and privacy. All of these are very app specific and Facebook specific that don't really have a lot to do with communicating with friends. So I really like the difference between the color usage on these same kind of gradient style, but the color usage kind of helps distinguish the app settings versus the kind of social network settings. It's also important to note that all of these things are very Facebook specific, whereas the home feed and videos and groups and notifications and more, these are a little bit more app specific. And Apple has a lot of standards with their tab bar and the way that they want certain icons to be designed. So it might be actually distracting if they were to use these icons on the main news feed, but they can get away with it here because this is a page of content and almost like a secondary navigation of this big list. But it would be overkill to have this style of icon in the tab bar because this is more of like a system settings. This is like a very, like, here are the navigation items. You don't really want to draw a ton of attention to these icons because these are very, very utility. So you can have a little bit of personality, but you want there to be you want them to be toned down because they're in a tab bar. And the same way on this Instagram page, like the focus is on the content. And when you're looking at all the content, you don't want a bunch of different colorful icons kind of disrupting that flow. So that's why you'll see a lot of more kind of simple glyph state icons inside of tab bars. And for like view switching up here, it's going to be a lot more simple, a lot more restrained, just kind of lines and shapes. You've got your back button, grid view versus what you've been tagged in versus the little more icon. But you'll notice each one of these, I've got my little red square here. These are all roughly fitting inside of a 24 by 24 container. This little video, this little kind of shows you that multiple photos are in this post. And then again, all of these tab bar components, and they're having to combine the profile photo with the icon. So they all want this to be a pretty consistent look and feel. And it's the same thing in the Twitter app. Very consistent usage of size, and the Twitter app has pretty restrained styles for their icons, but they're all roughly 24 by 24. Even the more icon up here, they are breaking the bounds a little bit with their container, but they're doing that just so you can have access. So it looks nice and cohesive with the avatar right there. Looking more closely at these icons, they're all treated as blocks. And there's very even space between here and also between each other. Very, very consistent spacing. And there's also very consistent line usage. And the negative space between these lines, it has a similar feel to this one here. And the bookmark is a little bit wider. They wanted the bookmark to be just as wide as the list icon, just so it has the same type of feel, and then all of these are kind of common and their personality is similar. Down here, they're using a little bit more detail, but it still has that same feel. So you got these kind of double lines off of each other that gives it a little bit of a texture. And then they're using those same double lines down here in the icon for the light bulb that goes from light mode to dark mode. And all of these main icons are 24 by 24. But then you'll see right here, this is kind of the second most common size. This would be more of 16 by 16 size. So if you have a smaller subset of information, the 16 by 16 size is going to be a great secondary reference. But the style is really similar. And so they've grouped out all these 24 by 24 icons, and now they're bringing in these 16 by 16s. And it's very intentional with how they're using those sizes for the main navigation. But you could imagine if they were using big 24 by 24 icons in the context of one tweet, that would just feel too cluttered and crowded. So you can get away with smaller icons at 16 by 16 pixel sizes when the interface can afford those smaller little details. All right, so let's take a quick look at a few of my projects to add a little bit more variety to this lesson. All right, so this is a profile page inside of an iPhone app. And for this project, I'm pretty sure I had a kind of a combination between an icon set I was using and possibly kind of modifying these to work to kind of extend that set. And you can see here, I've got a 24 by 24 avatar. And even though in my layers, I'm not using a 24 by 24 bounding box, you can kind of see that all of these are pretty consistent. This was actually quite a bit older of a project. So I'm actually surprised that I'm not using at least symbols inside of here. But you can see that if I draw that 24 by 24 bounding box, that all of this kind of is going to fit within that. All of these are going to fit nicely within that 24 by 24 bounding box. And usually that's the case. When you're using an icon set, you want to make sure that it has this one in particular. These are 1 pixel stroke icons. So you wouldn't want to have one of these with 2 pixels just for the heck of it. So you can tell this just kind of sticks out too much. It doesn't work well. You could, however, change the stroke of all of these to say 1.5 if you wanted them a little bolder. But then you can see this one's starting to feel a little bit too heavy compared to the others. So if I'm going bolder with the lines, I might want to take out some details. So now all of this feels a little bit more consistent. All right, in this example, you can see that I've got quite a bit of icons here. I've got a list view icon, a settings icon, and I've got my forward and backwards icons. And then I've got these little things down in here. I've got the volume icon, and I've got the muted icon. And these are not quite icons. They sort of are, sort of aren't. They're more of like a 1-letter label. They stand for stereo or mono. And we have these little sliders, but they all kind of need to feel like they're in the same family. And so one of the things I did in this project, so I have all of these icons as symbols, or these would be components inside of Figma, symbols inside of Sketch. But you can very quickly and easily see that every one of these icons is on a 16 by 16 artboard. And a lot of times when you're working on your own icon set, and even if you're working with an icon set inside of a project and it's not your own icon set, most of the time when you're working with these icons, it's gonna make the most sense to create little 16 by 16 or small 24 by 24 components out of them and then use those as components versus just pasting the vector shape right in there. It's just going to keep it a little bit more modular. You can switch out the icons a little bit more easily. And you can also make adjustments to the icons like so. Like if I wanted to pull these off of here and I wanted to make some tweaks because I wanted these two to look really similar, maybe I decide, well, these have rounded corners. So I really think that these corners should be rounded as well. But how rounded do I want to go? I might just start off with half a pixel, see how that works. Maybe that's a little bit better. Maybe this is slightly better than having the strike through. So maybe now that I can kind of view these together, I'm going to take this out and put this in. And now I'll go back to all of those instances that had the mute button and had the icon. And now I can see that all of these positions have been updated. So it's a really easy way to to keep the icon system kind of abstracted, just one layer. That way you can manipulate all of the icons together as a family, so you can see the negative space, see all the little details, maybe you change the colors around. But then wherever you use them inside of your interface, they are a nested component, or they're at the very least just one instance of that component that will just make your life a lot more easy. This is another great example of when it makes a lot of sense to keep your icons inside of components instead of just pasting them directly into your layers. You can see that inside of here I have a sidebar. So if I go into my sidebar here, you can see now I've got my sidebar icon send, sidebar icon request, sidebar icon contacts. So if I go in here even further, then I'm starting to get into those vector shapes, and I can get in here and start modifying those. But I have a version of each one. I've got the contacts, and then I've got contacts active. And for each one of these sidebar items, I've got icon request active. And so I've created 2 versions of these. That way, anytime I put my component of my sidebar anywhere else, I can just switch out the active versus the default, and it's just going to be easy to turn it on, turn it off, wherever I need that to be. And so that's just another advantage of creating these icons inside of a component early. Now, not right away. You can experiment with designing in layers and just pasting in icons and just getting an idea. But once you have a decent idea of where the icon is going to go, you can pretty much go ahead and draw your 24 by 24 square, create a component. You can have your icons live inside of a separate little artboard where you can see them, how consistent they are with everything else. And when you need to update it, it just updates all of your UI at one time. Last example of a custom icon set that I created inside of Framer for the SmartLine project. So look right here, I've got this artboard full of icons. It wasn't a lot of icons that we needed, but you can see that each one of these is 24 by 24. And I've got a very consistent kind of style going here. I've got rounded corners on the shapes, but then we're terminating the cap with a hard edge versus a rounded corner. And that's just more of a style preference. But all of these are very consistent line usage and just kind of created in a way, it's easy to kind of look at everything in this context and see how it all plays together. Like, you want to make sure that your magnifying glass isn't too short compared to the photo upload or the back arrow or the post icon. But once I have all of these, then I can put them into my component, and I've got inside of my component all the different variations of, so we've got dark as the active, we got light as the inactive. I've got my other icon here, that's the post icon, but then everywhere on all of these different instances, I can activate the active version of that particular icon. So just to recap, make sure your icons are functional and they add function to the thing that you're designing for. You don't really want to go too heavy on icon only usage without labels, because sometimes it's just going to be confusing. So if you have the opportunity to use an icon and a label, the majority of the time that's going to be better, unless there's only like 2 or 3 options and it's just very, very easy to differentiate between the two. Like home icon, it's going to be able to stand alone on its own. And the bells for notification, like those are becoming pretty ubiquitous and you can use a lot of those on their own. But if you start getting into sorting, filtering, and these other odd icons, even if it's a person, is that friends? Is that a group? Is that a profile? Sometimes you have to be a little bit more explicit. So don't rely too much on icon only usage. In fact, I would be very hesitant to use more than 3 icon only type designs without starting to introduce some labels. So for homework for this lesson, I want you to check out the Feather icon set, whether you use the Figma plugin like we have here, or you check out the feathericons.com. Try to play around with some of those icons. Notice how they come in as 24 by 24 icons. Maybe you create like a little sidebar navigation, or maybe you recreate the iOS settings app screen with those feather icons and you put a background. Just get a feel for working with a very cohesive set like that, just so you can understand what that's gonna look like on a very consistent basis. And if you wanna extend this even further, maybe you try to design 2 or 3 of your own icons that are similar to the feather icon set, and you just kind of keep it consistent, keep the line shapes, the strokes, the end caps, the negative space around the border. Try to keep all those consistent and balance that with your UI as well. Make sure your padding on top, left, right, bottom, all of that's the same. So dig into these feather icons, try to see if you can use them as they are with some customization, and even extend some of them for your own. So I can't wait to see what you come up with for this homework, and best of luck.